everybody. I'm excited to be here today for this episode of Life Psych Podcast, Baby Bump Edition. I have with me a really amazing guest today, Anne Wallen from Maternity Wise Institute, and she'll go into a little bit more about what that institute is all about. But before we do that, just to give an overview of what we're going to be talking about today, is a really, really important topic. So we're going to learn a little bit about what doulas are, because I think it's really important for people to understand that definition and know that kind of support that's out there for them. But Anne has a lot of experience and expertise in the topic of how narcissistic abuse and narcissistic personalities play a role in the medical field and how that can hinder and damage a perinatal journey. And what we can do about that as women and as families. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and be very empowering about how do you move through like medical trauma, because that's a really big topic nowadays, and it's something that happens to people. I think it's very sinister. I don't think a lot of people realize when it's happening to them sometimes. Like most traumas, unless it's really blatant and in your face. Sometimes trauma is that really sinister, really slow burn damage that happens over time. And we want to empower women to have the best experience during their perinatal journeys as possible. So that's really the goal of today's conversation. So Anne, thank you for being with me. If you could introduce yourself a little bit about your institute and about yourself, your background, that would be really helpful.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me today. I'm super excited about this topic because to me, it hits really close to home. So I'm a mom of 6. I've been doing doula work in some form or another for over 30 years. And back in 2002, 3 other ladies and I started an organization called Maternity Wise because we were looking for postpartum doula certification, and it just didn't exist. There were organizations that said that they provided it, but no trainings were happening. And so we decided, well, we know enough. We should be able to figure this out. And so between the 4 of us, we started Maternity Wise. It was just a postpartum doula certification at first, or postpartum doula training at first, and then we became a certifying body, and then we've added labor and added lactation and childbirth ed and infant sleep and all kinds of things. So this is what I do full time, is maternal health education and maternal health care. I'm still a doula. I still take on clients. I try to only do 1 a month max, and those are usually my repeat mamas who are like, I was there with them. Yeah, I was there with them before, and they really want me again, and that's always a super honor. You did a good job when they invite you back.
It's wonderful when a mother wants you back in her life for another experience of her, second, third baby.
Yeah.
It's definitely a privilege and an honor to know that you had such a profound impact on their experience.
It really is an honor because it's a sacred space. When you're walking into that very intimate, very vulnerable experience with someone, it truly is an honor. It's truly something that you can't take lightly. And so anyway, so I'm really loving that I can continue staying, in the field and keep my just knowledge on point as far as I'm still in the work. But while also teaching and now I'm the director of Maternity Wise. And so just keeping the education flowing, that is probably my number one personal value is truth and education. So educating the truth about birth, educating the truth about relationships, educating the truth about, systemic things that we see going on that are not healthy. Narcissism being one. And just to be transparent, I was raised by a narcissistic mother, and even now, still unfolding, still finding out about, discrepancies, as you go. When you know a narcissist, you know that there's a lot of lies that are told along the way. But because of that, it kind of set me up, and this is something that I've learned since, is that it set me up for being in additional narcissistic relationships because it felt familiar. And I think a lot of people, and I didn't know that that was how I was raised, right? People that are in a narcissistic family unit where the narcissist is kind of just running the dynamics of the family, you don't know that it's not normal initially, right?
It is your normal at the time.
Yeah, but it is your normal. And then when you get into a relationship that's also abusive in a variety of ways, could, likely to be additionally narcissistic, you don't necessarily recognize it as that. And I give doula work credit for kind of saving me out of this mindset, because what I found was that as I was working with these families in this very intimate environment, going through this, monumental season with them, I was finding that they were treating me better than my partner. And I was always confused. I was like, how come I get more respect from my clients, basic human respect from my clients than I do from my partner? And that started my evolution into just educating myself and really waking up to what is going on in these relationships. And how do I play a part in enabling that and permitting that? And then, sadly, I got into a second marriage. And my first marriage, I always joke saying he was an amateur, narcissist. In my second marriage, he was a professional narcissist, very, very malignant, very dangerous. And so I really learned a lot. But the thing is that once you can't unsee what you've seen, right? So once you learn about a narcissist playbook, you spot it everywhere, right? Once you start to understand,
hyper vigilant to it after you are aware
exactly, of it. Because that's a trauma response for sure. And I've gone through therapy myself. I've gotten a lot of, just done a ton of self-care and just really worked through understanding what are green flags, what are red flags, right? But now when I'm in situations where I'm helping clients, I'm hearing things that are being said to them that I'm like, that is a narcissistic statement. Like that's a narcissistic abuse tactic. And I hear it more and more and more. So then I started to really dig into it and say, and then also when I'm at births watching this play out and thinking, I know this. I know these tactics. I know this coercion. I know this manipulation. It's familiar. And so I started to really kind of dig into this topic of how is narcissism and narcissistic abuse kind of intersecting with our medical care, maternity care in particular, because maternal, that time period, you're much more vulnerable to manipulation and coercion and fear and just like poor decision making based on pressure, right? And so I started to look at that more like, looking at medical care in a larger scope, but looking at maternal care specifically and how is that, and we always refer to the narcissist playbook, right? It's crazy to me, but none of them have new tricks. They all do the same things, right? They all play out of this, we call the playbook.
Personality profile, right? So if you fit the profile, it might look different in the experience of it, but the play is similar in all aspects and all, throughout all different people that you meet if they have that profile.
Yeah, and if you wouldn't mind, I think I know what the definition of narcissism is, but would you mind when it comes to that spectrum, because I know it's a spectrum, and there's healthy narcissism, that's self-care and self-respect, but then goes into maybe a different form that's harmful.
When I have talked about this topic with some clients, the more harmful type of narcissism in terms of relational experiences that people have, the two things that come up a lot are the lack of empathy, that is sometimes very hidden, because sometimes it doesn't show up as blatant lack of empathy, like in a more of like a sociopathic way. You could spot lack of empathy very clearly because their facial expressions are more blank. There's more apathy there. But with narcissism, it's sometimes hard because they can fake the empathy or give other types of what they believe is love, because they're usually damaged themselves in some way, right? So I like to put that out there too. People who have this personality profile that's damaging to relationships, they probably had some really difficult and damaging relationships or trauma in their history, and just never became aware of it, and their protective mechanism became narcissism in some way, right? But yeah, lack of empathy. And once you can spot it in narcissism, you get this almost like a spidey sense. You were describing it like when you're with your clients, you can feel it come up in different areas now. It's not just in romantic relationships or familial relationships. It's in other areas in our lives, which is what we're talking about today. So I would say it's the lack of empathy. And then it's like this grandiose vision of themselves that creates a whole reality around them. It creates the power dynamic because it's them being above in some way and knowing more than and being right all the time. Mm-hmm. So we see that a lot. And when people in relationships like this fall into those patterns, they become very, a lot of times what I see, at least, this is my experience with clients, become very meek, very unsure of themselves, like just follow blindly what other people say. It's not even just their partner anymore that they do this with, it's other people in their lives. And so it really affects how they move through life. So I'm not sure that's really defining narcissism in terms of like by the diagnostic code, but those are two of the largest like personality traits that I see that become really damaging for relationships, and then for that particular relationship, and then for it kind of like bubbles out into your life in other ways.
And what I find is that the more empathetic that a person is, the more likely they will kind of fall to the tricks, right, of what a narcissist is doing and the manipulation. And I like that you pointed out, that usually narcissists are someone who's had some kind of traumatic or some kind of damage, some kind of, for lack of a better term, a bad relationship situation that kind of fed into the reason why they are who they are and what they are. But I do want to point out that one thing I have really come to terms with is they know exactly what they're doing. It's not that they're like blind to it. What I find is that they're adept at their skills, at their skill set, and they know exactly what they're doing. Their motivation might feel to them innocent,
justified somehow.
Right? Justified. But they definitely are aware of what they're doing. And they're definitely, especially when it comes to like the manipulation, which is to me a keystone of what you're seeing in maternal health, is they have reasons. They're taught that compliance is key to solving any issue, right? They're taught that in order to get the best outcome, they have to be managing and in control of and over interventive, because that's the only way to control the outcome, to prevent a bad outcome. And a narcissist's biggest fear is failure, exposure, like something to go wrong, loss of control, loss of that ego, right? And so if something goes wrong, that means a crack in all of those things.
Yes.
And so not all doctors, and we talked about this before we started, but not all doctors, nurses, midwives, like not everyone that you meet in the medical industry are going to be narcissists. Not everybody, and I tell my students this all the time, nobody wakes up and says, I wonder whose birth I can ruin today, right? I wonder who I can give some birth trauma to today. No, nobody does that. But what does happen is they're taught, how to gain compliance, because compliance means you're going along with their control and their management. And they're taught that in order to gain compliance, they have to come in acting really big, very confident. That authoritarian kind of attitude has to come forward, because that's how you gain compliance, which that works usually, and this is stereotypical, but that usually works really well with men. With women, oftentimes they're in this very vulnerable state. And so when you come in like that, that doesn't trigger respect like it does in a male counterpart. It triggers fear. And so when you trigger fear in a birthing situation, now you no longer feel comfortable to be vulnerable around this person and in this circumstance. And that in itself creates dysfunction in the labor process. Because the labor process is very much like, and forgive me for going there, but I'm going to go there. It's very much like orgasm. It's all the same chemicals. It's many of the same body parts. And if you could sit in a room with strangers and have an orgasm, then birth would be a cakewalk with, this hospital situation, right? But that's not how we're made.
There's a reason it happens more privately and in a very safe setting, intimate setting.
Yes. And so the same way that orgasm functions in our body as females, we need safety, we need darkness, we need, not necessarily darkness, but we need that environment that feels cozy and safe, and I can let down my guard and I can check out for a minute, right? And so if you can't feel that way during birth, when your oxytocin, which is the top chemical,
we'll get into hormones. I'm going to ask you directly about the hormones. Yeah.
So, your body needs that oxytocin hit in order to continue getting those contractions in a way with the power that they need behind them and with the pattern that they need in order to bring forth a baby. And then also on top of that, your body needs to be able to relax and feel vulnerable in order to open up and let your baby out. And so if you can't feel comfortable, safe, able to be vulnerable, able to check out, able to let your body take over in birth, you're going to have dysfunction in your birth. And at this point, when I started, my oldest is 32. When I first started having babies, she, birth was like, you go in, there were no epidurals. Like, not that I know of anyway. Epidurals kind of showed up in the late 90s. My third born, I was offered an epidural, but I didn't take it. But, you didn't have this mindset that birth is impossible, that birth is dangerous, scary, it's a crisis. I need all this intervention. At least that's not how I grew up learning about birth. I learned about birth that it's going to be, could be painful. It's going to be work.
Labor.
But it's a natural process.
It's actually called labor.
Yeah, imagine that. But now people that are giving birth now, they've grown up with this mindset that birth is scary. It's an emergency. People die. Like, it's this huge, it's not true. It's this very crazy perception about what birth is. And because they believe that.
I find that a lot with clients, with my own personal circle. Fear is such a driving force in the perinatal experience, and it's instilled a lot of times, maybe not meaning to be, but by the providers that are providing care for my friends who are pregnant, my clients who are pregnant, and it's always interesting when I have conversations with them about, well, how did you come to agree to have an induction? How did you get to the place where you were having an emergency C-section? Like, how did that birth story happen? How did it get there? And sometimes it's completely, and I'm not a medical professional in that way, so I'm not judging that community. Sometimes it sounds like, sure, there was an emergency there. The baby was really struggling, or the mother was really struggling. Maybe there was some bleeding going on internally, or just the baby got stuck in a way that they can't figure out, how to maneuver the baby. There's definitely reasons, and thank God for the emergency services that we have. But what I've found in the stories of my friends and clients is that a lot of times that these interventions are being offered before the emergency is actually there. And then the fear kicks in, like, oh, well, you have this like anticipatory anxiety. I don't want that to happen. I don't want to hemorrhage. I don't want my baby to get stuck if they're bigger and my pelvis can't handle the stretching. And so the fear then really interrupts, like you say, the labor process. But how did we get there? We got there because of the dialogue between the provider and the patient. So
Yeah, but also just the mindset, how do you control a population? The best motivator to control a population is fear. Make them afraid.
So much nowadays, right?
Hello, government. Make them afraid. They'll do whatever we say, right? And so this is part of that issue. And sometimes, so I describe providers who use coercion in two camps, right? Number one, they know better. They know that what they're saying to their client and making them afraid, they know that the statistics don't really look the way they're trying to paint them to look, right? They know that what they're saying is more about their convenience or their profit or whatever, their own reasoning. They know that they're using statistics in a way to manipulate the feelings of the client. The other type of manipulator, and I'm not saying all doctors are manipulators, I'm just saying when you have a manipulator in front of you. The other kind is someone who might just be ignorant. And they might be saying, based on, they were taught fear, right?
Regurgitation.
Yes, and so now they're just saying what they believe is, true, and it's not. But neither one of those caregivers is safe. Because you've got the one who's going to lie to you on purpose, or the one who's going to lie to you because they're ignorant. Who wants an ignorant caregiver? And who wants a deceptive caregiver? Right? Neither one is a safe caregiver.
I think that's the systemic issues that you kind of like alluded to earlier on, that it's like a whole system of how people got taught about birth to begin with and about the care of a pregnant woman, that if we crack or like open up a door that there's a potentially an alternative way for this, then I think there's a lot of fear in those communities that the whole foundation cracks. Then it's like, well,
absolutely,
what do we do then, right? Because like then your reality bubble is popped, and it's like popping a narcissist's ego, a narcissist's ego. You really create a lot of damage when you do that. But I think sometimes the best way to examine something is by totally popping the reality you think you know and exploring all these alternatives for yourself. And that's really my goal, and I think a large part of, since I've gotten to know you, a goal of yours, like you said, educating people on just what's out there so they can make the informed decisions. One of the topics that I think is so important in here, in this conversation, is informed consent versus implied consent. And the only way to get informed consent is with education and conversation, openness.
Yes. Right? Yeah. And just the truth about everything, and really truly understanding the math. Most people don't understand. I don't hardly understand math, but most people don't understand statistical analysis math. It's complicated, right? And so when you say you've got a 50% greater chance of stillbirth if you go beyond this week, 50% of what? When you say it that way, it makes a mom think, oh my gosh, my risk of stillbirth is at 50% if I go over 41 weeks. No, honey. It's 50% greater, which means half of what it already was, that much more added onto the top. So if you've got and this is for easy mathers like me, if you've got a 1% chance, which you don't, you have less than a 1% chance of stillbirth, much less. But if you had a 1% chance, it's just, like I said, for easy math's sake, 50% greater would mean 0.5% added on. Now your percentage doesn't go from 1% chance to 50, it goes from 1% chance to 1.5% chance. So yes, it increases, but is it increasing enough to have a whole population of women getting induced in order to avoid that?
Why? What are the factors behind why that chance would increase for you in particular? Do you have those risk factors present?
Right.
Or is it just simply
Yes.
because you're going past a certain gestational
Right.
week?
Right. And that's the other thing, is that we need to take personalized, customized care into account, and evidence-based care into account, and not just, if you look back, and typically men are the narcissists, right? There's plenty of women narcissists out there, but typically it's a masculine form of behavior. And if you look at how did birth even get to where we are, right? You had all this home birth going on, only home birth going
Only
on.
home birth, only home birth.
Yes.
Yeah.
And no, it is not correct that babies and moms were dying left and right. No, because midwifery care is very, very safe, right? And when something went wrong, they would get those women to a hospital when there were hospitals available, and those women would get the care they needed. But for the most part, midwives were very, very skilled in being able to handle a whole realm of interesting dynamics and just a variety of birth presentations, of labor patterns, of whatever it is. Midwives are very skilled in how to handle all of that. Now you move birth into a hospital setting, or let's back up even before that. Now you've started to get midwives who are looked at as witches. You have this whole religious piece that they're, but really, if you actually dig into it, it was more about midwives being single women who owned property. Those were the ones who were burned at the stake. So you've got...
What point in history was that? Because I remember reading a book about the history of midwifery, but I can't remember when that switch happened from midwives being basically the only type of caretaker during birthing process to there being more of like this skepticism and a little bit more of like a demonization of the midwife practice. When was that?
Well, demonization of midwives has been going on for eons. So that's not new, and that wasn't necessarily the turning point either. Okay. So the turning point was when male providers, when doctors started to think that it's important for them to get involved in birth. And so doctors began to attend women at home. Or even, well-meaning doctors who would go with midwives to learn their craft, right? But then, masculine solution to a feminine issue, they said, it would be so much more efficient if we had all the birthing people coming to us rather than us going to them. And so they started to bring birthing families, and I shouldn't even say families because men weren't even allowed to come into the birthing room, but women were brought to hospitals between the 30s and 40s is when you started to see that shift in America. Okay. And I remember, because my grandmother was telling me, my mom was born in 49 or 51. And I remember my grandmother telling me, because her first two, she gave birth at home. Her middle, she gave birth in a hospital. She said it was so terrible. She went back home and had her next two at home again. But she was sold on the idea that giving birth in the hospital was safer, cleaner, better care, on and on and on. And she said it just wasn't any of those things. And because she had already given birth twice at home, she knew she could do it. She wasn't afraid like, something's going to go wrong, because nothing went wrong with her first two. So this was kind of this transitional time where women were trying to talk women into giving birth in a hospital using, a lot of different tactics. So bringing the patient to the hospital, and then now you've got, multiple people in one space where you can care for them all at the same time, but midwives aren't allowed in because midwives, you're not doctors, right? So a lot of times in hospitals, the doctors were in control at this point. And so midwives were the only ones doing home birth. Doctors were the ones doing the hospital births. In some places, midwives were allowed in. In some places, midwives were running the show. I mean, in other parts of the world, midwives run the show.
Yeah, they're the premier provider for that.
Yeah, they are your provider, and the OBs report to the midwives, right? The midwives are the ones who run the maternal care, and if you need surgery, you'll get referred to an OB who will go and do your surgery, right? And so that whole system, it was also part of a money-making business, turning birth into business. And it just comes right off the heels of a lot of other medical care turning into business kind of behaviors and kind of, ways that we treat people when they're sick. So now we see, in the late 90s especially, we see, well, in the 80s and 90s, I should say, we see a lot more use of medications during labor. And so not just pain relievers, but also induction medications. And we're doing, episiotomies where we're cutting women's vaginas in order to make space for the baby to come out, which is not necessary. Now we don't do that so much anymore. But at the time, again, it's a masculine solution to the feminine process. And the other thing about birth is that it's very mysterious. And so when you have a mysterious bodily function, that irks the heck out of people who want to have a formula. And it also really makes it difficult to be insured. It makes it difficult to bill. It makes it difficult to predict, right? So when you have a crisis, like a sickness that goes around the world, and now we want to get people in and out of a hospital as quick as possible because we don't want them exposed to this particular sickness. We want to get them back home where we've told them to stay. Now we employ instant inductions, scheduled cesareans, get you in, get you out, because it's safe, right? It's the safest thing. And so you have this kind of growing setup using pain meds, using induction methods, using all these different things. Then you have the pandemic happen. And since the pandemic, the inductions, the scheduled C-sections, they have not gone back down to normal. They've just continued to increase. Because when you do that, you see what a profitable, easy scheduling, like all the business side of birth is so much better and easier and well structured. Why wouldn't you keep doing that? That would be the best business decision, right? And most of the time, the people who are making the decisions about protocols, about time, about how we care for patients, it's not the caregivers.
We see that in so much of the medical community. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because the financiers are in charge of the profits of the hospital, and they're the ones, that board are the ones that are going to come back and say, hey, you didn't do enough C-sections last year. You cost us millions of dollars. You're going to lose your practice rights unless you have this many cesareans a month. Did you know that there's quotas? Nobody wants to talk about it, but there's quotas.
Yeah.
There's quotas at schools for kids who have vaccinations. There's quotas at hospitals for number of hours that you have to have someone admitted for. If your kid needs to go to the NICU to be observed, even if they get there and 15 minutes later they're like, no, he's fine, send him back to his mom. They cannot do that. They need to keep him for 2 hours. That's the protocol of, making sure that they're okay. And that's because you can't bill a NICU visit unless it's 2 hours long or more. So if you have somebody who just stops over for a short little check-in, they can't bill for it. So now we're keeping babies for 2 hours. It's all about
really when you follow money, a lot of times in any industry, in any, relationship, that you have with a system, when you follow the money, you see more of the truth a lot of the time, unfortunately. And understandably so, when you're running a business, you want the bottom line to be good. But it's a lot of times what I think we're finding now with more people out there like yourself being able to educate and being so educated in a wealth of knowledge about these topics, we're finding that the bottom looking good is coming at a cost to the care of people. And that doesn't sit well with mothers. That doesn't sit well with families when they have little babies that are being taken care of and their care is dictated by a system versus what is really best for this child. Let's look at the individual and treat them based on what their needs are. But it's much more time consuming to do that. It takes a lot more holistic knowledge to treat individually and holistically. So Yeah, there's so many things as you were talking that I had like that I could dive into in a topic of its own that I'm so interested in.
I know. It's
I'm just trying to
so,
be.
yes, absolutely. It's so, there's so many little rabbit trails we could just go off on. But the thing that
Yes.
I'm trying to explain when I'm saying all of that is that it's creating this perfect storm for narcissists to operate within. And so when you have this kind of situation and you have people who are taught to come in with authority and to come in with ego, because if you come in and you feel self-assured and you act very self-assured, then people will automatically trust you, supposedly, then that helps with the bottom line, right? And
Right,
so,
right.
practitioners are not just taught symptom A plus symptom B equals pill or procedure, which is really the majority of what they're taught, but they're also taught how to gain compliance. And unfortunately, gaining compliance, on their end, it looks like gaining compliance. On our end, as patients, it's about consent. And I always say that doulas are, or should be, the guardians of consent. And you can't be a guardian of consent unless you have fully educated your client. So we can talk about brains, we can talk about a lot of different, techniques. But the bottom line is when you're walking into a situation where now you're in labor, this is not the time to be questioning what's right, what's wrong, what should I do, what are the benefits and the risks, and please, doctor, spend the 15 minutes that you need to explain this to me and allow me to ask you questions. That's not going to happen. And so this is where doulas come in, because doulas should be always providing preparation for their clients, education and preparation ahead of time. Because like I said, how are you going to, spend the time and have these conversations when every 90 seconds you're having a minute-long contraction? Or,
Right. No, it's not the time or place for it.
no.
That's why, it's the education prior to is so important, but so many women are just walking into labor blindly. And it's so interesting because even with the knowledge and education that I have about the different types of care out there, there were still things I realized in the moment. I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't prepare for this particular part of labor. So now knowing that, I'm expecting now. So my second, hopefully I'll get that education, or I will make it my business to get that education and awareness so that I don't go in blindly to those aspects again. And that's the goal, right? We can't know everything, but we can know a lot. And there are ways to gain that knowledge. And I'm so glad that you brought it back to how I love that you said that doulas are the guardians of consent. That's a really interesting way to frame it. I often talk about birth or the perinatal period being such a vulnerable time because these when we look at it from like an energetic or more of a spiritual aspect, especially when I'm working with people in the mental health world, it's like there's a lot of portals. I talk about them as portals that open up in a woman that we're always there, right? All these energy spaces are always there, living inside of us. But there are so many pieces of us that get shielded or just covered or buried throughout our lives because of just life. Sometimes trauma, sometimes just difficult experiences. So we kind of shut them down because they're just not necessary to pay attention to. But then you become pregnant and you're going through this really, like you say, mysterious process. Yes. And all of those things can come back up very much like a flood. And so then because we're very pain averse and fear averse in this country, we get scared of it and we don't look at it. And my job, or what I believe part of my job, is to encourage women to lean into that discomfort and look at those parts of themselves so that they can become empowered during this process. And not that I have all the answers for them, because I certainly do not, but encouraging them to find the people that do have the answers and help allow them into the process with them. Let people walk the journey with you. We weren't meant to do this alone. So the vulnerability aspect and the openness aspect of being pregnant and going through labor is such an amazing opportunity for growth, but can also be really dangerous because you're so open to vulnerabilities, you're open to threats. And that's what we're talking about. That's a large part of what you were talking about today, Anne. And I think that allowing professionals and caretakers into the process, like a doula, can be very protective and supportive to this vulnerability, and allow it to be a stage of growth in somebody's life instead of a stage of fear. So if you could talk just a little bit, I know there's so many techniques that doulas use, but maybe just a one that you find like your most favorite, or doulas tend to gravitate towards to help during this process, especially help with this this topic that we're talking about today of finding a way to create consent and understanding through the process. I would love to hear what your one of your favorite tools are.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I teach and I use with my clients is two things. One is really just turning it back onto the client, and the other one is what I call pick a corner. So I'll explain both. Let's say you're there as the doula. I'm there rubbing my client's feet. Doctor walks in and says, "All right, we're going to break your water now." And they don't. So this is part of implied consent. When you walk into a hospital and you've signed that paper, you say, "I allow you to do what you think is best to me." Right? And part of compliance is not getting a refusal. So that's all implied consent. If I say I'm going to do something to you and you don't refuse it, you have implied that you are consenting. And so when a doctor comes in and just announces what they're going to do, I turn to my client and I say, "How do you feel about that? Do you want your water broken right now?" And I teach them ahead of time that they need to, anytime they're refusing something that they don't want, they need to call it by name and say they don't want it. So, "No, I don't want my water broken right now." Right? And so that's clear consent, or non-consent, refusal of consent. So sometimes, though, the physician will just ignore the patient and just go about what they're going to do, right? And because I'm the doula, I'm kind of watching everything they're doing, and if I see that they are still pulling out an amnio hook, or if I hear them ask for the amnio hook or whatever, then I say to my client, "You don't want your water broken. Is that what you just said? You don't want your water broken right now. Is that what you just said?" And so then they can echo back to me, "No, I don't want my water broken." Right? And then if they continue, which has only happened a couple of times, then I pull out my phone and I say, "Well, at 11:55, I heard you say that you're refusing your water being broken." And I raise my volume a little bit because I'm just repeating what she said. I can't speak for her as a doula. That's not my job. I legally cannot speak for her in this situation. But I can repeat what she said, right? And so I'm pulling out my phone and I'll say, "Okay, at 11:55, you refused having your water broken. Can you just make sure that that's in her notes on her account as well?" And I say that to the nurse. And I say it nice and loud with a smile on my face because I'm not trying to fight anybody. Yeah. But I just make sure that it's really clear, and maybe doctor had their mind on something else, right? And they didn't hear her the first time, or they don't, maybe they don't care. But I'm going to make note of it, right? I'm going to document it. I'm just going to use the word document. I'm just going to document here that at 11:55 you refused having your water broken. And as soon as you use that kind of accountability speak, suddenly consent matters, right? And so if you have a doctor, which is not common that you're going to have a doctor who's just going to bulldoze your client, but sometimes they do, and they do it with a smile on their face and they do it with charm, and those are the narcissists, right? But you can stop them in their tracks because you're like, there's going to be accountability here. Right?
Yeah. Thank God it's not common, but I'm sure in all the births you've attended, you've experienced some things like that.
Quite a few times. And most of the time they come in and they say things like that. "Okay, we're going to do this now." Or, "Okay, it's time to do this now." And the reason they say it that way is because the client doesn't know any better. They think the client's just going to go, "Oh, okay." Maybe it's their first baby, it's their first birth, and they don't know. They just think, "Oh, this is part of the process." It sounds like it's part of the process. It sounds like that's the next thing. okay. And I'm, having birth here. I'm having labor. So the sooner we can get this over with, I'm good with that. Right. And so the client is not necessarily thinking what might happen next, what are the benefits or what are the risks. And so in birth, so in preparation, I'm going to go over the benefits and the risks. But in birth, you might have different scenarios play out in different ways. So for example, doctor comes in at 3 centimeters. That's not a good time to break your water. Hang back. Don't be increasing the risk of infection. Don't be increasing the risk of baby getting stuck in that pelvis in a wrong way. Like, no, 3 centimeters, not a great time to be breaking your water. But what if doctor comes in and you don't know what the centimeters are that she's at, right? Then she can ask questions. And so if she's unsure, if I say, do you want your water broken right now? And she says, yeah. And she says, I don't know. Should I? Then I say, is there more information that you'd like to have before you make this decision? Like, do you want to know how far dilated you might be at this point? Do you want to try other positions before you go to that, procedure? Like, are there other things that maybe you have in mind before we go there? And it's so really I'm giving, I'm giving options because they need to have options. They can't, it's not informed consent if they don't have the information.
Right. What I hear a lot of when you're talking right now, it's there's so much alignment with the world that I live in on a daily basis in the mental health world when it comes to what's called trauma-informed care. And that is a huge buzzword out there these days, but it's also something that I do see, and this gives me some hope and just optimism for the process and for the systems out there. There are a lot of hospital systems and medical institutions that are really intent on teaching their providers what it is to be trauma informed. And when I say trauma informed, that doesn't mean that a client that's in front of me has maybe experienced trauma. They don't have to have had trauma in their history for trauma-informed care to be the right path. Because what we're doing with trauma-informed care is also trying to prevent trauma from happening.
Yeah. Right.
So being able to invite a client, a patient, into the decision-making process is what I hear you doing with your patients, with your clients. And that is, in my experience with midwifery, with OBGYN care, with other medical providers, especially ones that are more my age, so that it's a new generation of medical providers, they are more likely to ask than just to tell. Of course, I've been in situations where they're the authority and they're telling me but a lot of times what I find is that they're of a different generation of doctors. So I do have optimism in this shift. It might be small, it might be slow, but it is, I believe, shifting, and I hope that these conversations help with that shift. But that is what I hear a lot of, and I really love that kind of approach of, well, all I'm really doing is advocating for you to have a voice in this process. Because what we find with birth trauma is it happens when people feel a loss of control or their voice was not listened to.
Yeah.
That's when we see women after in their postpartum saying, I don't really know what happened during labor and I feel really uncomfortable now. And then that's a process, right? We have to process through that. Something bad may not have happened to the baby. Something, detrimental may not have actually happened to the woman going through labor, but just the feeling of a loss of control or control being taken from them can feel very unsettling. So giving them back that opportunity during that process, such a vulnerable and intimate process, is such a gift. So I really love a lot of what you just said. So thank you for that.
Yeah. So the thing that we find too is that trauma isn't just physical, right? So trauma doesn't happen only because there was an emergency or baby had to go to the NICU, or it's not always that. Like, a lot of times people think, oh, birth trauma. Well, you don't have birth trauma because your birth went fine. But trauma happens in the mind. It doesn't happen necessarily
Yes.
because of external events. Yes, of course, that too, but the trauma that's happening is that helplessness, right? And so that disrespect. And one of the things that we see play out when you're dealing with a narcissist is the objectification of another person. And so you're looking at the narcissist practitioner is going to look at the patient as just another one of those, if that makes sense.
Like a body, not an individual.
Yeah, a body, just an other, right? And I always say narcissism and racism go hand in hand, and that's a whole nother talk for another day, but racism is a hot topic right now because we recognize that if you walk into a hospital with a black body, you're less likely to come out.
That's so statistics unfortunately show. It's really sad, but yes.
Yeah, and when I teach on narcissism, I explain that, you wouldn't have racism without narcissism, because narcissism says I'm better than other. Racism says I'm better than other because. And so it can go whatever direction, right? Any kind of what's the word? The intersectionality, that comes into play. That bias happens because there's a narcissistic mentality in the person doing the bias. So when you're looking at encouraging interventions and kind of interrupting or demanding compliance or coming in and saying things that are scary, in order to get compliance, there's an objectification of that person. Now we're not looking at that person for their experience and what they're going through. We're looking at it as, this is my experience. I'm the doctor. You'll do what I say because I want this to go the way I want it to go. And so unfortunately, in their mindset, the way they want it to go, they believe is the safest way.
Right. That's what I was going to interject and say. It's a lot of times because of this liability factor, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't want risks here. So what have I been taught that reduces the risk most profoundly? And that's the path that they're going to present. Or,
that's the control. The control, the active management. I had a client recently because the whole Arrive trial has happened now, and now it was not a very well put together study, and most major organizations have already spoken out about it. Although if you look at some of the midwifery associations, they have, I don't want to say recanted, but they've removed their strongly worded statements against it. However,
with what you're talking about, you said the Arrive trial.
So the Arrive trial is why everybody's getting induced at 39 weeks right now. So there was a trial that was done. It was a small sampling. A couple of doctors created this study to get a specific outcome because they had an agenda to begin with. And so the idea was, we want to prove that inducing at 39 weeks doesn't create any bad outcomes, in fact, creates better outcomes. And because of the way they set it up, they got exactly what they were looking for.
That's so typical research, though, nowadays, right?
Yeah. But the problem is that it's affecting millions of people around the world because they're following this
affecting protocol
recommendation,
scientific research, right?
Yes. And so I've had clients who are told, you have to induce by 39 weeks or your baby could die. I had a client recently in the last, 4 or 5 months who was told she had to go in and get induced at 39 weeks. And she said, no, I'm going to wait for spontaneous labor. I believe in my body's ability to do this. And her doctor actually said to her that she's being selfish to put a good birth experience above the life of her baby. And that her baby will die if she doesn't get this induction at 39 weeks. That's completely so not evidence-based, completely so just out of the realm. But when you're dealing with a narcissist, there's no limits. Yeah. So when you're dealing with a narcissist, there's no limits to what they'll say to get their agenda, to get what they want. And when you say no to a narcissist, and we should talk about brains. I still want to tell you about the pick a corner technique I have, but we should talk about brains as well, because the N of brains, a lot of times people say no, right? That the N stands for no. If you're dealing with a narcissist, you never want to say no, because saying no to a narcissist is like waving a red flag in front of a bull. You say no to a narcissist and they immediately receive that as a challenge. And now they're going to show you who's in charge. They're going to show you why you need to comply. They're going to bully you and coerce you and manipulate you and lie to you and pressure you until you give in. And they'll use all the tactics in their playbook to do it.
Is brains a formula to help a woman going through this process cope with these kinds of manipulations? Like, what is brains?
Brains is actually a decision-making acronym, and you can use it in any part of your life.
Okay, so it's not specific to narcissism, but it just is very helpful in this world.
It's definitely helpful. So B stands for benefits. What are the benefits of saying yes to this, right? R is what are the risks? What are the risks? What negative consequences could come out of me saying yes to this situation? A is what are the alternatives? Do I have an alternative that I can choose instead? I is intuition. What is your gut saying? Because even though you might weigh the pros and cons and you might think with your brain that you know what the benefits and risks are, your gut might still be red flagging it, right? And so you might still just be like, I need to trust myself on this one, and it's a no. The N stands for not now. So it's not a no, it's not an ego push. It's a not right now. Give us an hour. Give us 5 more contractions. Give us 10 minutes. Give us whatever, right? And we don't have to ask permission to have time and space, but S stands for space. So taking time away from the pressure of someone standing over your bed and wanting your answer, you can ask for space. If there's a true emergency going on, you're not going to need to be using the brains. That's not a thing. If there's a true emergency going on, they're going to be throwing scrubs at dad, taking the brakes off the bed, and wheeling mom out the door before you get a chance to have a conversation. If you get to have a conversation, now this is the thing, and I'm not trying to put down any moms who had an emergency C-section, but many times I am told the story of how an emergency C-section went. And it went like this. So I was induced and all these things, and then I got my epidural, and then the baby wasn't moving down, and I couldn't push the baby out. And then the baby kept having D cells. So, after some discussion, we decided we were going to go in and, have a cesarean and get it done so that baby wasn't at risk. Okay, so that is how that played out. Could it have played out differently if you had made different decisions at the beginning? Yes, but that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is, was there a course of events that led to a decision to go into the OR, right? That's a planned cesarean. Might not have been planned by mama.
So you're saying it wasn't an emergency C-section. It
wasn't an emergency C-section. An emergency C-section means something is happening right now that is dire and needs emergent care, right? If something is happening that doesn't look so good, you can have a time to plan it. You can have time to go in there calmly. That's all fine and good. Sometimes this is the best way to go into the OR, not in a tizzy, not scared and freaking out, right? But the scared and freaking out, that's an emergency C-section.
Got it. Understood.
If you're going through labor and something's going wrong and you have time to discuss it and give consent and say, all right, we've tried everything, nothing's working, we should, just go ahead and take it to the OR. That's a planned C-section. But a lot of times people come away from that and they're like explaining it to people as, oh yeah, I had to have an emergency C-section.
I've heard that story before.
Yes.
Right? From personal
and
in my circle.
And sadly, unfortunately in our day and age, we don't give attention to the good stories. We give attention to the dramatic stories, the emergency stories, the bloody, gory, scary, stories that are like really intense and exciting to tell and exciting to listen to, right? We give attention to those stories. And
But it
so
feeds the
when,
fear. It's so unfortunate. I see it happen to
yes,
pregnant women all the time. Other women will come up to them like and explain how their horrible experience of labor and all the pain and oh my gosh, it was horrible, this, that's the other thing. And I come in afterwards and I'm like, I had a really great experience in my labor. And those
and like
are
people
also,
are like, stop it, Maria. We don't want to hear your boring story.
those are really common too, and you don't need to hear something that's going to increase your fear because fear stops labor.
But also, who tells those stories over and over again? The ones who are traumatized. And this is, as you know, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir. I'm saying your words for you. But when you have trauma, one of the ways you deal with trauma and you heal from trauma is processing it. And one of the processing is telling the story over and over again. Yeah. And so you have women who don't feel the need to share their birth story, right? And sometimes even feel bad that they had a good birth.
Yeah.
Because somebody else is telling their birth story and it was this horrible crisis, right? Or they've made it out to be a horrible crisis because of the way they were treated or because of the way that it went, or because they don't get enough attention on the regular, right? That they need to now make this more dramatic than it really is because they're trying to get attention, because now they're postpartum, they're at home, they're alone, they're lonely, they want some interaction. And so they're going to tell this crazy story because it gets them the attention that they're craving. And so we have like kind of just, it's this messy cycle of self-perpetuating, problems where if you're in a hospital situation and you're with a narcissistic doctor, they know this. They are going to play on all of those fears. They're going to play on the stories. They're going to even maybe tell you a story or two, but they're going to work all of the societal pressures, all of the, fear-filled statistics, movies. Like if something comes out in a movie, I had a doctor one time say, "Oh yeah, well that, didn't you see that movie recently where she had a baby in a cab or whatever?" And he's like, "You don't want to be having a baby in a cab." And so my client agreed to an induction because she was worried that if she went into labor on her own, she would have her baby in the cab on the way to we live in New York. So, so like things like this, it's just, it's sad, but the only way out of it is education and bravery, right? And support, because it's easier to be brave when you have support. Have you ever heard of that story? The where you have there's a person where, I don't know if this is a study, but there was this example where people were shown this mountain, right? And they were standing there alone. They're supposed to estimate how tall is the mountain, and on a scale of 1 to 10, how difficult, how challenging will it be to climb this mountain? So they give their statistics. Then they have another group of people who bring a friend. And with their friend, they stand there, they look at the mountain, they estimate how big the mountain is and how challenging it's going to be to climb the mountain with their friend. And over and above, every single person estimated the mountain to be smaller and estimated the difficulty challenge to be less the people that had their friend next to them. The ones who were alone, just the perception of the challenge, and it could be, it could essentially be just psychosomatic, self-fulfilling prophecy, that you believe your birth's going to be miserably horrible and it's going to go terribly. And,
I've had clients with that narrative who have come, and I've met them after in their postpartum, and it came true for them in a lot of ways, and it's unfortunate, but then our job is to change that narrative for the next experience that they have. But that is so inspiring, just the example of the mountain with a friend and the perception of challenge. We weren't meant to do these things alone. We weren't meant to go through life alone. That's my true deep belief, that humans are connected in ways that we can't see, and we're supposed to use each other to get through this experience of life. So having a support system around you, and if you're blessed to have that support system in the way of family and friends, that's wonderful, but they're not always the most educated because maybe they haven't gone through it or haven't educated themselves. So creating another, like what I would call, so you have your village, which is your family and friends, and then creating a tribe around you of professionals that can really create that confidence and empowerment, and bravery, as you put it, right? So are there ways that Maternity Wise specifically can be reached out to by mothers? Like how would a woman who's looking for support utilize Maternity Wise to gain support?
So Maternity Wise is just a school. We
It's
provide education to the doulas that are going to go out there and help those mamas that you're talking about.
Okay.
And so if a family is looking for a doula, I would recommend, there's a lot of different places to find doulas. So PRC is one of them.
Yes.
If you contact MaternityWise.com and you let us know where you live, we can share that with our student doulas. We have a lot of student doulas who are willing to do free care, but as part of their evaluation process, but they need they need to connect with those families. So if there's a family that needs care but they can't afford it, finding a student doula is a great idea. There's also doulamatch.net. Most places you can find doulas in your area on doulamatch.net. There are a lot of great places to find doulas. The other thing that I would recommend is, just no matter where you are, look into your local mom groups.
Yes,
and get some word of mouth. Yeah, so the word of mouth is probably one of the best because it's somebody who's legit. But I would say as much as possible, seek out a Maternity Wise doula, just simply because our doulas are trained to such a high standard. I don't know of any other organization that does quite what we do.
And you could tell just by how you were educating today, and I mean, I've learned a lot from you today just in this short period of time. So you can imagine the curriculum that your doulas go through. So if anybody out there is looking for a great training because they want to get into this work, Maternity Wise is a wonderful institution to look into. It would be MaternityWise.com. What is the URL? MaternityWise.com. Okay. I want people to know that. And then, of course, for the moms out there, yes, the Perinatal Resource Collaborative has a number of doulas that can be reached through the collaborative to connect you with that support. We have the Supported Moms Club that moms can access for free and then connect with doulas through there. That's supportingthemom.com. And then if you're looking for more of a holistic approach to like mental and physical preparation for your perinatal journey, Reimagined Mind has a program called the Mama Method, and we have multiple practitioners, one of them being a doula, who help walk you through the things that you didn't even know you didn't know, right? The things that are so important and crucial to a successful perinatal journey, but maybe you didn't even realize were pieces of information that you can learn. So you can find that on reimaginedmind.com if you're looking for an empowerment kind of program to prepare you for motherhood. But there are so many resources out there, these being just a few of them. But Anne, I want to thank you not only for the wealth of knowledge that you've presented today on such a crucial and important topic to this population, but also for sharing your vulnerability with us and the listeners of the podcast. I think in sharing, yes, we heal ourselves in a lot of ways, but we also allow the space then for other people to realize it's okay to have gone through something that maybe damaged them, but that damage doesn't have to define what they do moving forward. It can actually empower them. And that is truly moving from a trauma to an empowerment narrative. And that's the goal here. And so I just really wanted to thank you for that. I appreciate it very much.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And, just because you went through something that's really heartbreaking or life altering, one of the things that we do in our trainings, we call it the core hurts exercise, where we go over, we dive into, because our training is not just about getting to know birth, but it's also about getting to know ourselves as a birth worker. But we talk about, let's look at an event before, and the way you know that it's a core hurt event is that you can definitely see that you had life before and then life after that event. And so even if you have an event that happened to you, or a situation that you went through, or even just like decades, lifetime of abuse, or whatever struggles that you've been through, the lessons you get out of that are so valuable. And as a young person, you don't really know that. But I'm going to be 50 and I'm proud of it. But I also know that 50 years of all kinds of, making mistakes, trying this, learning that, down the road, you have no idea how your opportunities are going to open up to you to help other people. And a lot of times it's based on what you've learned in the past, things that were hurting you in the past, that now you can share and be really valuable to someone who's also going through it. You can help them get through it and out of it and on a healthy other side of it. And I know as a therapist, that's your whole job, but even as a woman, right? Just even as a woman, we crave tribe. We crave support. We crave each other. And so it's really important to, be vulnerable, be authentic. You can't have a relationship with another person without having some level of authenticity. Yes, protect yourself, don't just throw all your luggage out there for the first person you meet. But at the same time, don't be afraid to be a little vulnerable and to be transparent, because like you said, it can help other people to recognize that it's safe and you will get through it. I don't know if any of your audience are Bible readers, but there is a Bible verse that says, you will use the comfort that you were given to comfort others. And I really believe that. I just, from a, not even just necessarily a Christian perspective, but just from a world truth perspective, that it's interesting to me how people come to me often and tell me stories of things going on in their lives that I'm like, I see that. I know what's going on there. I know the behind the scenes. They don't necessarily have to tell me the whole story for me to get a glimpse, to really understand how I can kind of encourage them. They don't need to be treated that way, or they don't need to believe the lie of whatever, and it does come with time, but even, little examples. We have a doula who is a trainer now, and she recently went through the sudden death of her father. And now we have another staff member who just went through the death of her mother. And they live relatively close to each other. And even though that was heartbreaking for her just a few months ago, she's able to help the other one with the process, the steps. Who do you call? What do you do first? Who do you call next? What do you do next? What are the pitfalls? Like, what are the ways that funeral homes scam you? So all these different things that the younger one wouldn't have necessarily had any idea where to begin. But she's got a doula, a life doula, right? Essentially. And so that's what friendship is.
Yes.
I just think doulas, shmoolas, we all need to be doulaing each other, right? Because the word doula means servant. And we all should be having a humble, serving, supportive attitude toward one another, especially as women. It's tough out here for women. And so we need to be here for each other.
Amen to that Bible verse. Amen to everything you just said. And yes, it is a strange culture we live in now. Very disconnected, yet, we could connect at any moment's notice through technology, yet we still feel very disconnected. A lot of competition, a lot of fear-driven behavior, as we discussed earlier. So finding spaces where womanhood and sisterhood can thrive without judgment, because that's really the key there. I see a lot of mom Facebook groups, and it breaks my heart when I see some of the stuff spewed out on there, because women are just looking for support and then they're getting really harshly judged sometimes. Sometimes it's amazing and the support is so beautiful and all the prayers that go to people, and that's what you have to lean into. But finding those spaces, because they exist, really can support not only the perinatal journey, but our life's journey. So I really appreciate you being here. I'm so glad we've met through the PRC and other avenues now, and I look forward to our continued connection, because it's important to keep those connections when you feel they're authentic and genuine. So thank you.
I love that. And you mentioned before about energetically connecting with other people, and I think that's why Zoom is not enough. Teams or FaceTime or whatever people use, it's just not enough. We really need to be able to be in the same room with each other, giving each other hugs, wiping each other's tears, and yeah, I do a lot of work virtually, but there's no substitution for being in the same space with people at the same time.
There isn't a substitution for it. I'm glad we have these pieces of technology because of the reach, but especially when it comes to birth work. I mean, it's very localized and in person and vulnerable. You have to be able to touch and be intimate with that person in order to help them through that process. So I couldn't agree more that there's no substitute for it. Thank God we have it, but it doesn't replace the in-person connections. So.
Absolutely. Well, it was so fun to be with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So I will put all of our information for people who have been listening in our show notes so that people can easily access our websites and the support that's out there. But Great. Thank you so much for listening. And Anne, thank you again for being here with me today.
Thank you.
Bye.